If you've ever wondered how a 3D game is made, or maybe you want to make one yourself, then stay tuned. I'm Wesley Shillingford, and let's look at how to make a 3D video game. First of all, let's look at some of the stuff that I've been involved with. So this is a simple RPG character creation screen. You can change the nose, do a bunch of other stuff. This is a inverse kinematic experiment I was playing around with. This is a thermal vision sensor or filter. And this is the latest game that I've created, and I'll go into a bit more depth about this. And then here's a few of the screenshots, a few of the things I've done. So what sorts of things do you need in a 3D game? Well, you're probably going to need some 3D models. You're going to need some sort of input to allow the user to change something about your game, such as moving the mouse around, moving the joystick, maybe a phone's rotating, things like that. Probably going to need some sound. Probably got some background music, some character dialogue, maybe so you've got some weapons firing. They will add to the 3D game experience, although it's not technically required, but most games will generally have some sound. And again, physics or collision detection, not strictly required, but generally most 3D games do have some sort of physics in them. Maybe you're just walking around some terrain. You want to be able to respond to that correctly. And there's a bunch of other stuff depending on what type of game you're actually looking to create. So what sort of skills are you going to need, and what sort of programs do you need to be able to use? So first of all, you're going to need to know a programming language. I'd say the three biggest ones for creating games these days are C++, Java, or C#. There's a few other ones like Python you can use with Pygame, but I'm not familiar with those, so I can't comment too much. But I know they're not used that often. I'd say if you're inexperienced, then start with Java or C#. There's plenty of books available and tutorials on YouTube and various resources on Google, so you should be able to get up to speed quite quickly. You need to know how to use a 3D modeling program. I've only really used Blender, and I would highly recommend it. It's only getting easier to use, and there's so much resources available, so it's quite easy for beginners to get up to speed with it. You're going to need to know a bit about 3D math, but I wouldn't say you need to know a lot. A lot of 3D engines these days can abstract the hard things about it away from you, and so you need to know very little, but you need to know a bit. You also need some artistic talent, but again, I don't think you need a lot for 3D games. I'm actually really bad at art. I can barely draw a stick man on a piece of paper, and I actually think 3D games are easier to make than 2D games in that respect, because 2D games require probably a lot more artistic backgrounds and characters, and 3D textures are really much simpler in that regard. And I would recommend either GIMP or Photoshop. GIMP's free, Photoshop you have to pay for, but it's probably the most used program in industry, and it's also very good. You need to know how to make some sound effects and background music, but again, this is the sort of thing that I'm not very good at, and I'll show it in the later slides how I can get around not using these programs. Mainly for sound effects and background music, you might be able to find some free stuff online. Not a lot, but if you're just starting out, then I would recommend you use that for now. And you're going to need to know a game engine. Generally, you can go lower level, but people starting out and people looking to be more productive, I'd say go with a game engine which sort of does a lot of things for you. And you're going to need a lot of dedication, because there's a lot to learn and it won't be quick. Before, I used to say you needed a lot of motivation, but as this graph shows, motivation can vary on a day-by-day basis, so you can't actually rely on it. you need to say to yourself, even if you don't want to do something, because you've got no motivation for doing it, just do it anyway. Else you'll never get it done. Okay, so you've just gotten out of bed and got hit by an amazing idea for the best game ever. So where do you even start? First of all, what does your game even achieve? What sort of platforms is it aiming for? Do you want it to run on an Android phone, iPhone, PC, Mac, Linux, any of the consoles? Once you've got that sorted out, find a game engine which gives you all the features you need. If you're just starting out, you probably want it to be free, and there are plenty of free ones out there. Not all game engines give you 3D capabilities. Some are just specified for 2D, so check that it's a 3D game engine if you want to make a 3D game, which is what my talk mainly covers. It's got to be in a programming language that you can program in. If you're very good at programming, then moving from one language to another is not that bad. But if you are just starting out, then make sure it's in one of the languages that you can program in. Is it multiplayer? Does it need sound? Handle the input for you, physics and animation of 3D models? You need to check all this. And there's a few other things depending on what type of game you're trying to create. And so I mostly use something called the JMonkey engine. It's free, it's open source, so that I can dig into all the internals if I want to, and I have. And it's a 3D game engine written in Java, and so you can only use Java with it. And here's a link which gives you a list of pretty much all the game engines out there with all the features they have, with loads of different reviews from different people, so I check that out. Okay, so now let's look at how I created my latest game. It's called Multitasking Minigame Madness 6D, and I was mainly targeting the Android platform. And here's a few screenshots. Okay, so how did I go about starting it? Well, the idea initially came from a competition that was being run by the JMonkey Engine community. And it was actually being run at the same time that I was meant to be revising for my final exams at university. But fortunately, I decided to do the game instead. And here's a little video of it one day into development. So I was mainly just seeing if what I want to do can actually be done. So I wanted to see if I could play two games simultaneously side by side and get them seamlessly transitioning from one to the other. So there's not much to look at, but it was still early days. Unfortunately, I joined the competition about 2 months after it had already started, and I had just under 2 weeks to make something, and this is what I achieved after that. I had about 20 to 25 mini-games, which is something that I focused on more than the actual graphics. As you can see, they're still pretty abysmal, with like 3D primitive objects like cubes and spheres, and a bit more color and texture, but not a lot. Probably the best thing about it is the background that's spinning around, and that is something which is called a cube map, which is 6 textured images on a cube which is sort of infinitely away from you. And the ones that I was using were from a program called Spacescape, and they only actually took like 5 minutes to create, so it's very good for placeholders at least. So after the competition, I had to go back to university to resume my final year of studies, and so this project went on the back burner for quite a while. But I managed to find some time, and for 6 months working on this part-time, this is what I had achieved. As you can see, the 3D models are a lot better. There's better textures, shaders, sound effects, which you probably can't hear, but never mind. The 3D backgrounds are a lot better. It's a lot more smoother. The transitions are better. I think I originally at some point had about 50 minigames, but some of them were too hard or I didn't like them in particular. So I got rid of quite a few of them, and I've left with about 25. And I'm probably going to add some more in the future at some point. So now let's look in a bit more detail about how I created my main 3D character. So a 3D model, generally made of triangles, but in the 3D modeling program you generally want to leave them as quadrilaterals because they're just easier to model around. And I used Blender for my model and something called a mirror modifier, so that I only had to draw half the model and the other half is projected on the other axis automatically for me. And so here's another view of it, but some added features like some feet, and it's been smoothed just to make it look a bit better. And here's the character when he's got a head. Unfortunately, the head's probably the most difficult to model of a character because there's so many different variations and it's very easy to make it look very weird or wrong. The arms in this image have been a bit more smoothed out, a bit more clean. He's got antenna for some reason. I'm not sure why I added that, but I ended up removing it again. And here's the final character when he's been textured. He's got a few more features on his mechanical arms at the bottom, such as bolts and wires. He's got some gloves and a few different things. So now you want to be able to animate the 3D model. And to do this, you need to first create a skeleton, which is composed of loads of different bone segments with different constraints. So for instance, the knee joint of a human actually only moves in one direction. And so you want to give your character the same sort of limitations, so you won't get any weird movements. And then you want to map the bones to the vertices. Luckily, in Blender there's a tool which can automatically do this for you, and it's very good at it. And then you want to create different poses and animate between them. And I actually designed this character around myself because I didn't know what else to do. So I took a load of photos of me from different angles and used it as a background to create my model. And here's the final texture map. So to texture the model, you have to create what's called a UV map. You put seams around the model and then basically flatten it, and then you can texture it in GIMP or Photoshop or even inside Blender if you want. And it's just some wire I found laying around, which I actually ended up using for the mechanical arm, if you can see. Now let's look at how I created some of the sound effects for my game. They were actually all created using my voice. I'll play a few of them for you. Very easy to do. Okay, so I used something called the Nifty GUI for all the main menu screens, and for the actual in-game GUI, it was something that I created so that I could easily batch the elements to improve performance, which I'll discuss a bit more in the next slide. And then most of the physics in the game is actually 2D physics. And it's based on square-square collisions, and the squares don't rotate. So it's very simple, but very effective for what I wanted to do. I do use the Bullet library, which is a 3D physics library for the throwball minigame, and it's a lot more powerful, but requires a lot more resources. And here's a few numbers about the final version. I had 53 different 3D models, 6 animated models in addition to that, 69 textures, 20 different sound effects, which I did myself, just one background sound track that I made in Fruity Loops, and 70,000 lines of code in total. And it took 2 years because I wasn't as dedicated as I should have been, and I also spent quite a bit of time trying to optimize it so that it could run on an Android phone, because trying to run two games at once, not very effective. So what are the sorts of challenges that I faced? Well, first of all, Java and C#, they're both garbage collected languages, and the garbage collector can cause pauses if the garbage collector is not optimized for your application, and you can sort of minimize this by using pools of variables and not allocating unnecessary amounts of memory than you need to. And Android phones, they vary. You can have very powerful ones and very bad ones. So you need to sort of aim for somewhere in the middle, I'd say. And so my first attempts were very abysmal. So my main character had about 3,000 vertices, 70 bones, and my current Android phone could not handle it very well. So I had to simplify it. I used something in the Blender modeling engine called a decimate modifier, and I simplified my model down to about 300 vertices and about 15 bones, and so that helped quite a bit. And I also had to optimize the JMonkey engine a few times to not affect my application as much, because it's just a general engine, it's not just optimized for Android. And one of the things that's very important is to try to reduce the amount of draw calls that you make to the graphics processing unit, or GPU. And here's one example, is that the entire in-game GUI is actually one object. So all the different triangles are moved internally, and to put a different image on them, you reference this master image called a texture atlas, and you just reference a little subunit in it, and you're able to give the illusion that it's a bunch of different objects when really it's just one. And for 3D, you also want to try to batch as much as possible, because for large environments, the brute force approach of just displaying each object individually does not scale very well. But for simple games, it should be fine. So here we come to an end. So games have never been easier to make, and they're only getting easier. So you want to start off simple and just build it up from there. Don't try and do everything at once. So have a try of my game, so that you can probably understand this talk a lot better. It's free, so you should have no excuse. And here's a quote from Albert Einstein: imagination is more important than knowledge. And I would say this is very applicable to games. And so good luck and have fun making your games, and if you have any questions, then you can leave them in a comment below. Thank you.